Hello, my name is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to walk students through the study of Lesson 2 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Classical Grammar course. And as I explained in Lesson 1, classical grammar doesn't refer to the study of the grammar of the classical languages. It's an English grammar course that's taught for students who are going to study the classical languages. So it presents ideas and concepts in grammar in a way that will help students who are going to be pursuing a classical education in the future. In the first lesson, we studied English orthography, the study of the letters and sounds of the English language. And we learned that letters are used to make syllables, that syllables are used to make words, and that words are used to make speech. Therefore, words can be considered the parts out of which speech is made. In order for us to learn to speak and write rightly, which is the goal of the study of grammar, we have to become masters of words. And yet, if we look at a dictionary, a good dictionary, a serious dictionary, like the Oxford English Dictionary, we'll find that there are tens of thousands of words. And so, in order for us to study language and become masters of language through the study of the art of grammar, we can't study individual words one by one as if we were studying a vocabulary list. We have to find some efficient and orderly way to gain mastery of words so that we can gain mastery of language. Now, what wise men have done through history by studying language is that they have discovered that even though there are tens of thousands of words in a language, these words, all of them, all of these thousands and thousands of words can be divided into just 8 simple groups, 8 classes of words. Now, while it's impossible for us to study all of the words in a language, what we can do is study the characteristics of each of these 8 classes of words. And when we learn the characteristics of each of these classes of words, we know something significant about all of the words in each of these 8 classes. So that's the efficient and wise way to go about studying language. In the art of grammar, we study orthography first, which is the study of the letters and their sounds in a language. And then secondly, we study what's called etymology, which is the study of the parts of speech, or the 8 classes of words that are used in a language. So up here on the board, you can see the title of this lesson is The 8 Parts of Speech, and I've listed and numbered the 8 parts of speech. Now, in English, there is some confusion about the 8 parts of speech, and if you study modern grammar books or even older grammar books, you'll find that they don't agree on the number of how many parts of speech there are in English. But in classical Latin and Greek, we learn that there are 8 parts of speech, and when we come back to English, we can see that the same 8 parts of speech are found in English, but they need some clarification. And so we're going to maintain that the number of the parts of speech in English is 8, and we'll understand what the 8 parts of speech are and how English requires a little bit of explanation for us to number the parts of speech at 8. So, in this chapter, we're going to walk through our classical grammar text and learn not necessarily definitions, but at least descriptions and examples of the 8 parts of speech, and we'll deal with a couple other issues that come up along the way. So let's study the 8 parts of speech in English. Our lesson starts out This is chapter 2 in Arnold's Classical or English Grammar for Classical Schools. Rule number 8 says the name of every object that has or is conceived by the mind to have an independent existence is called a noun substantive or merely a substantive. You can see that the first part of speech listed here is nouns. Nouns are the first class of words in our language. Nouns. And what we learn in that first rule is that there is a certain type of noun that names an object that has independent existence. That's what the rule says. So the first thing I want you to note is that nouns are simply names. Nouns are simply names. And in Latin, the English word noun is translated as nomen, which is simply the Latin word for name. Nouns are names, and there are two different kinds of nouns. The first one, substantive nouns. Substantive nouns are names for objects that have an independent existence. That means they can exist by themselves in our minds as words. We're talking about words, not actual objects. We're talking about names of objects. Any name of an object that is able to exist by itself in our mind is a substantive noun. Your book gives you some examples. It gives you the example of a rose. If I say the name rose, you can think of a rose and it can exist as a name by itself. Rose. Another example would be flower. Flower. That's a name for an object that is able to exist independently by itself in our minds. Another one is man. Man is a noun, a substantive noun. London, the name of the city, London, is another example of a substantive noun. And lastly, modesty. Modesty is an idea, something conceived in the mind to have an independent existence. Okay, modesty is an abstract idea, but it's a substantive noun because it can exist by itself as a name in our minds. So the first class of words are substantives, substantive nouns. All right, next, rule number 9. Such words as can stand immediately before a substantive or next to. It's better to say next to because these don't have to stand before substantives. Such words as can stand immediately next to a substantive to denote some property that we perceive in objects is called a noun adjective or merely an adjective. Notice that in each of those descriptions, for substantives and adjectives, it says that it's called a noun substantive and a noun adjective. That's the proof that substantives and adjectives are not two separate parts of speech, but they're two different kinds of nouns. Noun is the first part of speech, names for things. Names. The two kinds of nouns are substantives, names of objects that can exist alone in our minds, and adjectives, which are words that they're names of properties of substantives. They must stand next to a substantive because they exist in substantives. For example, we saw a list of substantives. We saw rose, flower, man, London, modesty. Adjectives cannot exist by themselves, but must exist in a substantive. So, for example, the adjective red cannot exist by itself. There can be no red by itself. Red is a property. It has to exist in an object, in a substantive. We can say a red rose. Red rose. Red can stand immediately next to a substantive denoting some property that we believe to exist in that object. That's an adjective noun, the name of a property or quality. Adjectives and substantives, two kinds of nouns. Now, moving on to the note that's under Rule 9, we'll see, it will be seen below that a particular class of adjective words are called participles. Participles are actually another part of speech. So this is one point where we're not going to follow what our textbook says. Our textbook suggests that participles are simply a different kind of adjective, but we're going to see that in grammar that's not true. Participles are not adjectives. Participles are a separate part of speech. And so that little note under adjectives about participles, participles are another part of speech. And I'll talk about them in a minute. Next, we read about articles. We read the peculiar adjective words a or an and the are called articles. So the words a, like a rose, a flower, a man, that word a is called an article. When the word that follows the article starts with a vowel, instead of a, we say an apple, an elephant, and so on. So a and an are called articles. Another article is the or the. When we denote one specific person, place, or thing, we use the article the. It's called the definite article. The rose, the president, and so on. Okay, those are articles. Now, notice here in your book, it refers to articles as adjective words. In this case, the book is right. Articles are adjective words. And so I have not included articles as a separate part of speech. I have not included them as a separate part of speech, but I've just kind of listed them with adjectives here in our list of the parts of speech. Okay, so nouns, we have substantives and adjectives, and with them will be articles. And the reason why is because articles are like adjectives in the sense that if I say, give me a rose, give me a rose, a really means one or any. Give me any rose, give me a rose, give me some rose. So you can see that the word a has the same meaning as one or any or some. It's like an adjective. It is an adjective. Okay? Same thing with the. If I say, give me the ball, give me the ball, I'm talking about one specific ball. Give me one ball. This could also be a pronoun, which we're going to learn about next. In Latin, for example, there are no articles. And the idea of an article, there are no articles in Latin. The idea of an article in Latin is expressed by a pronoun. So articles, they kind of float here, depending on how they're used and how they're expressed, between adjectives and pronouns. Okay? But I don't want you to consider articles to be a separate part of speech. Study the 8 parts of speech and understand that articles are, depending on the language, depending on how they're used, should be considered as adjectives or as pronouns. And we'll learn more about that later. Okay? So articles, a, an, and the. Next, Every word which we express, every word by which we express that persons or things do anything or are anything or have anything done to them is called a verb. Let me read that again. Every word by which we express that persons or things do anything or are anything or have anything done to them are called verbs. The third of the parts of speech are verbs, words that express action that some subject is doing, or that it has done to it, or that it is, just the idea of existence. Okay? Those are verbs. Now in Latin, the word verb simply means word, the word, verbum. The reason why this part of speech is given the name word is because in a sentence, in any speech, it is the essential part of speech. If there's no verb, there can be no speech. There can be words named, but there will be no speech unless there is a verb. There must be a verb. There must be a word that expresses that a subject does something or is something or has something done to it. If there's no such word, there is no speech, there is no sentence. And so it makes sense to refer to this part of speech as the word, the verb of the sentence. Okay? That's the third of the parts of speech, the verbs. Now we're going to skip down. We're going to skip down and read at point number 12. Such words as add to the notion, such words as add to the notion of a property or action, some circumstance of time, place, or manner are called adverbs. And you'll notice that I put this part of speech up over here as number 5. Let me read that description again. Such words as add to the notion of a property or action, some circumstance of time, place, or manner are called adverbs. So adverbs are words that add some kind of qualification or manner to a property or action. And remember, properties are expressed with adjectives and actions are expressed with verbs. So adverbs are added to adjectives and verbs to add more to the meaning or to clarify the meaning of those adjectives or verbs. Adverbs are words that are joined to adjectives and to verbs to add more detail to the meaning of those words. Adverbs. Next, a pronoun. This is point number 13 in your book. A pronoun is a word that stands for a noun. The word pronoun means for a noun. Pronoun. I've listed pronouns second here. We have nouns and we have pronouns. Pronouns are words that stand for nouns. So just to be simple, if I say, my wife is Dania Michael. My wife is Dania Michael. I love her. That word her stands in place of the noun wife or of Dania Michael. The word her stands in place of a noun. All right, that's an example of a pronoun. And there are many different kinds of pronouns because we use all different kinds of words to stand in the place of nouns to express different ideas. And we'll learn about them in the book as we go along. A pronoun is a word that stands in place of a noun. So these first 4 parts of speech, they're important. I want you to learn them as they're listed here. Nouns, pronouns, verbs, and participles. Nouns, pronouns, verbs, and participles. Now, to say something about participles, just so you are aware of what they are. I said that participles are not rightly called adjective words or adjectives. And the reason why is because nouns, all right, I don't know if you can see this on the video, but nouns do not express time. Names or nouns do not express any idea of time. Verbs express the idea of time. So we can have present, past, and future time in verbs. Nouns and substantives and adjectives do not express time. Participles express time. There are present participles, past participles, and future participles. And because participles express time, they're not adjectives. However, they also are not verbs. They make up a fourth class of words, a fourth part of speech. And that's why participles need to be considered separately. The word participle can be remembered because these words participate. These words participate in the qualities of both verbs and adjectives. So participles are verbal adjectives or adjective verbs. It's a separate part of speech. They have qualities of adjectives, but they express time like verbs. Okay, so participles are a fourth part of speech, and we'll learn about them later in grammar. So we've learned the first four parts of speech. The reason why I want you to keep these four together is that these four in most languages, including English, have different forms that need to be learned. Okay, these first four parts of speech have different forms. So we don't have just one form of a verb or one form of a pronoun. We find that the pronoun has a number of different forms that we use in speech. This is true of nouns, pronouns, verbs, and participles. They have a number of different forms. And so we need to keep these four together as one group of the parts of speech. The parts of speech that have different forms. All right? When we get to this second group of parts of speech, the reason why I keep them separate is because they do not have different forms. So for an adverb, there's just one word to learn, one form, and that's it. It's like a vocabulary word. The same is true of prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. All right, so two groups into which the 8 parts of speech are divided. These have more than one form that needs to be studied. These have only one form. Okay, so we've learned the first 4 parts of speech, and we've also learned adverbs. Adverbs are words that are added to adjectives and verbs to clarify or add to the meaning of those adjectives and verbs. Let's keep going here. Next, point number 14, a word that marks the relation of one thing to another is called a preposition. Preposition, a word that marks a relation between two or more things is a preposition. So remember the word relation, okay? Prepositions are set before substantive nouns. Prepositions are set before substantives to explain the relationship between that substantive and other substantives in a sentence. Okay? Let me see if they give you some examples. Yeah, they give you plenty of examples. On, in, over, under, through, above, below, from, etc. are prepositions. Okay, so I went to the store with my son. With is a preposition. It explains the relationship between I, the subject, and my son. All right? With my son. The cat is in the house. The preposition in explains a relationship between the house or the cat and the house. The cat is in the house. What is the relationship between the cat and the house? The cat is in the house. Okay, so that's the purpose of a preposition. A word that is used to express a relation between different substantives. All right? That is the sixth of the 8 parts of speech. Next, a word that joins notions or assertions together is called a conjunction. The 7th part of speech, conjunctions. A word that joins notions or assertions together. What does that mean? A notion is an idea. So something that exists in our mind, like a substantive, a word that signifies an object. If we want to join these ideas together, to say like the cat and the dog, 2 separate notions in my mind signified by words, cat, dog. If I want to join them together, I can join them with a conjunction. Cat and dog. And is an example of a conjunction. A word that joins notions or assertions, or sentences together. I could say, I went to the store and to church. So I can also join assertions with a conjunction, both notions and assertions. All right, that's a conjunction. The word conjunction, a junction, is joining together, or junction is joining, and this word con, this prefix con, comes from the Latin word cum, which means with. So conjunction means joining with. Conjunction. All right, the 7th of the 8 parts of speech. And lastly, a word, generally a simple sound, used to express some inward feeling. A word used to express some feeling is called an interjection. An interjection, the 8th part of speech. It's called an interjection. Jection means to put or throw. Inter means in the middle or between things. An interjection is an expression of an emotion, usually because we blurt out an interjection in the midst of speech. An interjection. So examples of interjections would be like, wow! If you see something that's amazing and you're filled with excitement and you react and say, wow! That's an interjection. If you hear some sad news and you say, oh, that's an interjection. Okay? If someone tells a joke and you laugh and you say, ha! That's an interjection. It's an expression of a feeling, usually by means of some simple sound, an interjection. Okay? Now, what's important about all of this is that any word that you come across in English, any word, tens of thousands of words, any word that you come across, you can put into one of these 8 classes of words. And so if you know what a noun is, if you know what a substantive noun is, as soon as you know that a certain word is a substantive, you know a lot about that word, what that word signifies. That word signifies an object that is able to exist independently. You know that about any word that is a substantive. An adjective is a word that names a property of something. Any word that is an adjective, you know something important about that word. Pronouns, verbs, participles, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. Every single English word, tens of thousands of words, all of them, or any of them, can be set into one of these 8 simple classes. These 8 classes of words are called the parts of speech. Now, in your lesson, in your written lesson, which you're going to study for mastery on your own, there's some more detail. But I think this gives you a helpful overview of the 8 parts of speech, because it's a little bit confusing to sort out the content of this original lesson and see that really, even though there are 9 or 10 or 11 points, there are 8 parts of speech. And articles and participles need to be clarified because this text isn't very clear, not as clear as it should be. So 8 parts of speech. Understand that substantives and adjectives are not separate parts of speech. They're 2 different kinds of nouns. Understand how articles, a, an, and the, relate to adjectives and pronouns, and why we can't really place them in one of these classes, but need to make a decision based on which language we're studying as to how we use them. In English, articles tend to be adjectives. In Latin, articles would be considered pronouns. Okay? In Greek, we learn separate words. Articles are usually treated separately in Greek, but we'll study that in Greek and keep that separate. Make sure you know the 8 parts of speech. Make sure that anytime you see a word, based on these descriptions of the 8 parts of speech, anytime you see a word, you should be able to identify what class it belongs to, what part of speech it is. Okay, that's a challenge for you. You're going to work on that in this lesson because the exercises require you to do this. They give you a passage or 2 to read, and they ask you to identify all of the substantives in that reading passage. And then you can go on and identify all the adjectives, identify all the pronouns, the verbs, the participles, the adverbs, the prepositions, the conjunctions, the interjections. You have to exercise yourself in learning to identify the parts of speech in anything you read, with any words. A good place to practice this is in Latin reading. If you take the Latin reading course, as you study the Latin words, you should be able to identify what part of speech each word belongs to. This is an essential skill in studying the art of grammar. This is something you have to practice and become good at. You have to be able to identify which part of speech or which of the 8 classes of words any word belongs to in a language. It's something you should always be thinking of. Anytime you see a word, you should ask yourself, what part of speech is that? You should ask yourself, is it a substantive? Is it an adjective? That is it a noun? Is it a pronoun? Is it a verb? Is it a participle? Is it an adverb? Is it a preposition, a conjunction, an interjection? What part of speech is that word? You have to exercise yourself in this all the time. It's an essential skill in grammar, and you'll see why later as we move on in our studies. So, in this lesson, lesson 2, you learn the 8 parts of speech with a bunch of other notes and helpful information. It's time now for you to study this lesson for mastery. Make sure that you can describe each of the 8 parts of speech and identify which class any word in English belongs to. If you have any questions about these, if anything that I've said is not clear, or you'd like a little more explanation, or you run into a word and you really can't figure out which part of speech it is, because some words are confusing, because some words can be considered as different parts of speech based on how they're used in a sentence. And so sometimes the same word can be a conjunction or an adverb, depending on how it's being used. So sometimes there is some confusion, and if you look up in a dictionary, you'll see that words can be more than one part of speech based on how they're used in a particular sentence. So sometimes there is confusion. Eventually that confusion will go away. But if you have questions like that, feel free to get in touch and I'll help you to sort these things out and make sure you clearly understand the teaching on the parts of speech in grammar, an essential part of the art of grammar. Now, one last thing before I wrap up. This list of the 8 parts of speech in any good grammar course, especially a classical grammar course, this list of the 8 parts of speech is basically the table of contents for the rest of the study of grammar. Once you know the names of the 8 parts of speech, you now have an outline of what we need to study in grammar. We now need to go and study all of the substantive nouns and learn about substantive nouns, all the details. We need to then study adjectives and learn all the details of adjectives. We then need to go study the pronouns and the verbs. Remember I said these have different forms. We need to go study all those forms and learn all about each of these parts of speech. And that's what we're going to do in the art of grammar. So if anyone ever asks you, what do you study in classical grammar? You should be able to explain, we study the 8 parts of speech in the art of grammar. Okay? So I hope that's a helpful overview for lesson 2. It's time for you now to go and study this lesson for mastery. God bless your studies.